Now, how many of you remember those first two lines of Love Lifted Me? Do you remember them? Okay. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. I think as a kid, I had trouble really understanding the explanatory power of those lyrics. But that's really what we were talking about last week, and it's what we're going to talk about this week. You remember last week, we began the process of sort of systematizing the narrative data that we've produced into a more sort of logical description of sin's actions in our world, of sin's role in the created order. And we did that by broaching two questions. First, we asked, what is sin? And we said the Bible gives us lots of different perspectives on sin. Sometimes sin is characterized as falling short of a divine standard. Sometimes sin is characterized as breaking a divine law. Often sin is thought of as disobedience and even unfaithfulness to a very real, very personal God who has a very real and very personal relationship with us as individuals and with us as His people together. But we also said that there is something else lurking in the biblical text. A recognition that sin has this power that is greater than just the things that we do wrong. That it is somehow this personified reality that works in our lives. It isn't dormant. You can't just sort of sin and then wall it up in one little corner of your life and think that it's going to stay there, because that's not how sin works. And then secondly, we asked, how does sin become entrenched in the life of a person? And we presented two different proposals. There's sort of the pathological approach, that sin capitalizes on our weaknesses. But then there's also the seduction approach, that sin offers us something that we want. And what did we say? We said it's not either or, it's both and. Right? And already you can see when we were asking that question that this notion of sin as personified reality was coming to the fore. We're going to keep going in that vein this morning because we're going to entertain two more questions. We're going to look at two more questions. And the first of those questions is, what are the domains of sin's activity? What are the domains of sin's activity? Now, as evangelicals, we are used to thinking about sin's activity at the personal level. We know that sin is active in our own hearts and in our own lives. And if we've studied the subject any, we understand that sin is at work at the cosmic level, so to speak. That's all the stuff that Paul talks about when he personifies sin in Romans, or when he personifies flesh in Galatians, or even Ephesians. Okay? We understand those things, but sometimes we forget, or sometimes we even intentionally deny, that sin is active at the institutional level and the systemic level. Now that proposal has been somewhat controversial because of the politics of America. Okay? And I'm thinking about this in light of the fact, we've just finished Black History Month. And one of the articles that Christianity Today published this month was by a scholar at the London School of Theology named D.T. Eberhard. And I can't remember the exact name of the article, but it was something like The Bible and Systemic Sin. Now, what Eberhard is trying to argue is precisely, well, maybe not precisely, that's kind of the point. What Eberhard is trying to argue is that sin isn't just personal, that it's also institutional and, in his language, systemic. Okay? That systems can sin. Now, what I've taught you, and I think this is still right, even though Eberhard marshals very good biblical support for his argument, in the end, he may be right and I may be wrong. But I've taught you that systems don't sin because systems are not people. You have to be a person to make a moral decision or to have a reaction that is moral in quality. Okay? You have to be a person to do that, and systems are not people. But I do think Eberhard is right that sin is active within systems. Okay? Now we'll come back to that in a moment. And sin is also active within institutions. Eberhard's argument is convincing, at least up to that point. And he quotes a long list of biblical texts pointing to his conclusion. Now, let's touch on three things as we think about particularly the institutional and the systemic domain of sin's activity. And the first of those things is, well, what's an institution and what's a system? Well, the way that I'm defining institution is it is the social groupings that give structure to human life. Okay? It's the social groupings that give structure to human life. Okay? You can't really do human life without institutions, what I'm calling institutions, because we as humans, we tend to live together. Okay? None of us really live as hermits. And even if you try, you have to work really hard to not have meaningful interactions with people. Interactions that are important to you and interactions that are important to them. Okay? So institutions are vitally important. Now, what are systems? Systems, when I talk about systems, I'm talking about the rules, the customs, and the values. The rules, the customs, and the values that allow us to live together. The rules, the customs, the values that allow us to live together as humans. Okay? So let's our second point is this. Institutions and systems can be both formal and informal. So what's a formal institution? Well, a military unit is a formal institution. A city council is a formal institution. A school is a formal institution. These are things that the institution is intentionally drawn up. It's produced. There are rules. There's a constitution. This is how we do things. Okay? What about informal institutions? Well, one of the biggest informal institutions is family. And by biggest, I mean most important. There's a little bit of an institutional element when a man and woman get married, but after that, it's not like a baby pops out of the womb and you give them a set of bylaws. Here's the family constitution, here's the family bylaws, you must read this and sign it within 7 days. They'll be able to drool on it in 7 days, but that's about it, No. In fact, so many families have these unwritten rules, okay, that structure how the family works. We'll come back to those in just a second. So what about systems? What's a formal system? Well, a formal system is something like our legal code. We call it a system of laws, right? And there's a hierarchy to it. It starts with the United States Constitution, and it flows down through federal law to state constitutions, to state law, to county and city ordinances and such. There's a whole complex web of rules that are supposed to govern how we interact with each other. And those things, of course, they dictate big picture things like, you can't just kill somebody because you want to. But they also dictate small things like, if you're on a city street in Fort Worth, you're not supposed to drive 120 miles an hour. It doesn't matter if you have a motorcycle. It doesn't matter if you want to. And the whole process, at least in our culture, the whole point is to balance individual and group rights with the responsibilities that all individuals and all groups have to society, right? That's a formal system. Well, what's an informal system? Well, in many contexts, economies or cultures are informal. Now, our economy is becoming more and more formal as each year goes along because, of course, we have a whole range of laws that affect economic activity, right? But in more simple cultures, the economy is really rather basic, and it's very informal. I come in with a goat, and I need a certain amount of flour. Can I trade this goat for that flour? Okay? And all of this, as you can tell, is kind of a continuum, isn't it? Because, of course, when you start to introduce money into an economy, that introduces a formal element. But it can still be informal, It can still be less rigorous, less structured. You remember I said that families have unwritten rules, right? Well, that makes a family not just an institution, but a system, right? We call it family systems theory. Rabbi Edwin Friedman is the one who really kind of developed that way of looking at families. But people like crisis chaplain Steve Cuss, people like Pastor Peter Scazzaro have found family systems theory very helpful for reading the Bible. Why? Because you can trace both virtue and dysfunction from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. I think we've used this example before. You got Abraham lying about who Sarah is to two different kings. So we're not surprised that Isaac does the same thing about Rebekah. Until the king sees Isaac and Rebekah playing We'll just leave that to your imagination. He's looking out his window one day and he sees them playing. Yeah. Okay? So then, and of course we did talk about this last week. Then you got, Isaac and Rebekah are both a little deceitful, so we're not surprised that Jacob is a liar. That's how he copes with life. He copes with life by trying to hornswoggle people. And of course, that tendency creates bitterness along the way, doesn't it? So we're not surprised that his 12 sons have issues, right? When Dinah, their sister, is raped by a local chieftain, notice what they do. Not only do they resort to violence, but they're sneaky about it. They get that whole city to circumcise themselves, and then when they're all unable to fight back, they go in there and kill them all. We see these patterns pass from generation to generation to generation to generation. Okay? So we have both formal and informal institutions and systems. Now, here's the third point I want to make about this, and it's real simple. This is where I think that line from the hymn this morning, the first hymn that we did, is so vital, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. Let me ask you something. If you as a person are deeply affected by sin, as well as everybody around you, and if sin is working both at the institutional level and at the systemic level, and if sin is working behind the scenes trying to disrupt God's will in the cosmic order, tell me something. What part of your life is going to be untouched by sin? It's everywhere. It's not just about your decisions. It's not just about what you do, although that's important. It's about everything around you. And even if you want to do what is right, if sin works on you long enough, it'll corrupt you. Believe me, I know. Now, we're going to transition to our fourth question. And it is going to feel like a transition, but not really. But not really. What are we asking with this fourth question? We are asking, what are the consequences of sin? And of course, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, right? We kind of enumerated them, but I want to group them maybe a little differently this morning. And I want to introduce kind of a new concept, although it's one we've talked about at this church before. What are the consequences of sin's activity in our lives? The first consequence is that sin stunts our spiritual and emotional development. And those two things, by the way, spiritual and emotional, are very closely related. And the reason for that is because most of what we do in life is not about what we've thought out. It's about how we react to social and emotional stimuli. When somebody says something that you're offended by, is your first response to strike back? Or is your first response to hold your tongue and think, wait a minute, what's going on here? Okay, so spiritual and emotional are very closely related. Now there's at least a couple of ways that our spiritual and emotional development is stunted by sin. There's at least two of those, okay? There's probably way more, but there's two that I want to highlight for us. The first is what I would call the sort of the biblical or theological way that this happens. Shame replaces innocence. Shame replaces innocence. Okay? Now, we've talked at length about that process and what it does to us. But there's just a couple of things I want to point out. When shame replaces innocence, what happens is I hide from myself and I hide from God. Now, when I hide from myself, I am hiding my own vision. I am obscuring, I should say, my own vision of what's really going on inside of me. Okay? So I'm coming to a place where I do not know myself. Right? And of course, when I hide from God, I'm also obscuring my vision of God. Why is that so important? Because as we sang in like every song we sung this morning, Christ is the only solution to our brokenness. He is the only solution to our sin. Moreover, God, the triune God, is the one who made us. He's the one who has the instruction manual for how we work and how we're supposed to live. That means He's the only master technician that there is for us. Okay? Now, that He uses other people, He uses doctors, He uses psychologists, He uses social workers. He sometimes even uses pastors, believe it or not, to help people. But God's the only one who has the instruction book, okay, for how I work. And so when I'm hiding from God and I'm hiding from myself, I have cut myself off from the pathways that will lead to my spiritual and emotional growth, that will lead to my healing. Now, the second way that I'm going to talk about that sin disrupts, that sin stunts our spiritual and emotional development is through trauma. Now, that's an overused word these days. Everybody's talking about it, and everybody's read a psychology book about it, so we all think we're experts on it. But I want us to kind of limit our definition of trauma to what Jim Wilder talks about, the psychologist and theologian. Trauma is an event in our lives that changes the way our brain functions. And he's not talking about changing for the better. He's talking about a release of so many stress hormones, so much cortisol, that we actually lose mental capacities. We actually lose emotional capacities, skills that we're going to need to cope with stress in the future. Have you ever had something happen to you in your life, something really stressful, and it feels like forever afterwards you feel hobbled in some way? You feel like you're mentally you're just kind of limping along. That's what Dr. Wilder's talking about. He's talking about those events. And what happens is our brain is the education theorists are right. Our brain is meant to lay a foundation, build on it. Lay a foundation, build on it. Lay a foundation, build on it. Okay? That's how our brains are meant to work. Not just in school, but emotionally. Okay? And so when trauma comes in and yanks out that foundation, the whole building can collapse. And even if the whole thing doesn't collapse, a part of it can. And now you've got to spend precious time, precious energy going back and rebuilding that part of the building. Now that would be bad enough if it weren't for the fact that also at the same time, a lot of times you're running in shame from the master builder, right? Isn't that how we describe Jesus? Isn't that how we describe the Father? Isn't that how we describe the Spirit? God is this master builder, and He's building us as individuals, and He's building us together as one body, the body of Christ, right? But now we're hiding from the guy who's got all the blueprints, who has the architecture degree and the engineering degree, and we're going, stay away from me. You know, I mean, it's understandable why we do it. Remember how we talked about this. We get hurt. I mean, we're not doing it because we think, oh, this is a great idea. I think I will completely obscure my own heart from myself, and I think I'll blind myself to God at the same time. Nobody's doing that intentionally. Nobody's doing that intentionally. But we do it because trauma hurts. How many times have you or I just called out to God and just said, don't you care? This hurts. Fortunately, He does care, but at times it doesn't feel like He does because it hurts so much. By the way, if you're following me, if you're really tracking me, you're starting to understand, wait a minute, He's not just talking about the stuff that I do. He's not just talking about the sins that I commit. He's talking about the sins that are committed against me and the way they cause me to react. And He's talking about just this broken, messed up world we live in. Bingo, you're right. Now, what's the second sort of group of consequences that we have? Well, it is broken relationships. And not just broken relationships, but distorted relationships. Let's unpack how that works, okay? One way that it works is through our old friend shame. You see, as psychiatrist Kurt Thompson observes, when we unplug the different parts of our brain from each other, we are also unplugging our brain from other people. How has God, the master architect, the master engineer, the one with the owner's manual to us, how has He designed us to work? He's designed us to work by talking with each other. Just last night, I was in some emotional distress, and I was calling my sister like I do every week. And part of me wanted to just go, I am not talking about this. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to risk any further emotional distress. I just want to get this done. Well, fortunately, my sister, she's my older sister, and she's done this rodeo before. She knows when to say, all right, what's going on with you? And of course, I immediately spilled my guts and I felt better. All of a sudden, I didn't feel so alone. What shame does is it isolates us from other people. We're too scared to admit our weakness, our vulnerability. And look, I get it. Admitting your vulnerability publicly means that somebody might take advantage of it. They might use it against you. Just on our way over here, we were talking about this very thing, and I said, I just realized this morning that this is perhaps part of what Jesus was talking about when He was in the synagogue at Nazareth. This is Luke 4. And he was talking to the people there, and he just kind of sighs and says, you people are going to quote to me the proverb, physician, heal yourself. They were going to use His vulnerability against Him, right? Of course, part of what He's saying is that they were also going to say, hey, do here what you did in this place and that place and the other place. Benefit us the way that you benefited them. That's part of what He was talking about. But the other part was that Jesus' vulnerability, Jesus' act of vulnerability was would not be received well. We have all experienced times in our lives when we showed weakness, and instead of getting a hug, we got a rebuke. And so we close ourselves off. The problem is we're closing ourselves off to healing, and we're closing ourselves off from the people who love us. There's a second way that sin distorts our relationships, and I've called it idolatry. It's when we overvalue a particular person or a particular relationship. This person is just everything to us. Ben Witherington, the great New Testament scholar, argues that, and he puts it in a rather controversial way. He says, idolatry is not just about worshiping someone else. It's about loving anyone other than God unconditionally. Thought that was an interesting way to frame it. But I would argue that it is also, idolatry is also about looking to someone else to meet needs that only God can meet. Looking to someone else to meet needs that only God can meet. Friday night, Natalia and I were watching the Gather 25 event online. And Jenny Allen, the event organizer, presented a sermon out of Exodus 31 and 32, where she challenged people to examine, what is your cow? What is the thing that you are trying to hold on to, that you are trying to worship alongside God? That's the thing that we're talking about here. Now, that's complicated by the fact that there are both things and people that we need. I don't remember who it was. Might have been philosopher James K.A. Smith, but I can't remember for sure. Observed that one of the frustrating things about being human is that we are, and this is how God created us, we are dependent upon other people who themselves are finite. They are finite in power, they are finite in lifespan, they are finite in abilities. It's just part of being human. But the point is to recognize that finitude. Thank God for them. Thank God that He has put them in your life. But then ensure that your ultimate dependence is upon God. Why? Because sometimes one person or one group is unable to meet the needs that you have. Or worse, that person or that group that you value so highly is actually corrupted by sin. We have to keep looking not at the golden cows, but at the real, true God. The God who spoke in a whisper to Elijah. The God who appeared as a storm to Job. The God who appeared as smoke and fire to Moses and the people of Israel. That God who does not have a form and who does not have the limits that any person or thing has. There's a third way, of course, that sin corrupts our relationships. It does that not by idolatry, not by overvaluing people or relationships, but by undervaluing them. We called that process depersonalization. What happens? Well, we begin to see the people around us as nothing more than tools that we use to meet our needs. This temptation is almost ubiquitous. It's everywhere. We do it in our personal lives. We do it in our civil lives. We do it at the governmental level, at the national and world level. It's everywhere. And again, it's hard not to. You know, I come here with and minister to you, and Natalia comes here, ministers to you, and we get a paycheck for it, right? Thankfully. And we know that exchange is part of it, right? There is a transactional element to the relationship, but at the same time, if we treat you as nothing more than a means to an end, if we treat you as nothing more than the mechanism that keeps food on our table and gas in our gas tank, not only are we going to be ineffective ministers, but we have sinned against you. And we have sinned against the God who made you. And who made you as more than, believe it or not, Nelda is not a piggy bank. Roy is not a money clip. Bobby is not a 401k. Believe it or not, he's not. Just ask him for money and he'll tell you that. He's not a 401, he's not your personal 401k, right? Martha is not a $100 bill. You are people. You all have so much more to give and have so many more needs that need to be met. You fit together with one another and with us like a puzzle. You are not the sum total of the benefits that you give to another person. And nobody, whether it be a spouse or a politician, should treat you as if your only value is in what you can do for them. And then, of course, there's the fourth way. And this is the one that Genesis really harps on, right? Misunderstanding and enmity. And we talked at length about how that misunderstanding takes root and divides us from one another. Now, with the stunting of our spiritual and emotional growth, and with the corruption that comes to our relationships, we shouldn't be surprised that sin distorts our character, our logic, our values, and our decision making. A lot of times the things that I told you this before, a lot of times the things that happen in our life are kind of reactions. So, if I go over and I stomp on Roy's toe, he reacts. Okay? And that kind of thing happens to us all the time. Something happens to us, and it happens to us, we react before we even have time to think about it. But sometimes we really do make decisions. We really do think things through. The problem is, sin has corrupted our character. It has corrupted the logic and the values that flow out of that character. And so our decision making will itself be corrupted. And we'll sit there and think, hey, this is the logical thing to do. This is the logical thing to do. This is what you do. I've got input X, and I went through this mental process and this mental process and this mental process, and I came out with solution Y. But all of that is framed by character. And if that character is corrupted, then the decision making will be corrupted too. And then over all of this, lingers that terrible, terrible curse. Suffering, chaos, catastrophe, decay, and death. And here's what's really interesting about that whole cascade, that whole catastrophic cascade of events. They cycle us right back to the beginning, right? Because what are some of the biggest sources, maybe most of the biggest sources of trauma in our lives? It's when we suffer. It's when chaos or catastrophe descends on our lives and turns them upside down. It's when we experience the decay of disease or of aging. It's when we die, or sometimes even worse, when someone we love dies. It sends us right back to the beginning, and now we're cycling through the process all over again. Now, as we conclude this morning, I wanted to try to visualize somehow the pervasiveness, the ubiquity and the pervasiveness of sin. I settled on a kaleidoscope image, okay? Because that really does capture all the different vectors and shades of sin's activity in our lives. But I could have just as easily used like a three-dimensional double helix, because it feels like sin is coming at us from so many different directions. And it is. That's why a transactional approach to the gospel won't work. It's why we spent so much time unpacking Matthew's gospel. It's why you can't just sort of give Jesus your little, well, I believe in you sticker, and Him give you back your get out of hell free card. That's not what Christianity is about. Because what's really going on is so much more universal, is so much more, well, let's use our words, pervasive and ubiquitous. So the response to our sin has to be equally robust. And frankly, though we play our part once God rescues us, frankly, only God could do this. Only God could address the sin that, or the mess that sin made, or the sin that mess made. I don't know which one. But only God could address the mess. See, I almost did it again. The mess that sin made in our individual lives and in our world. Praise God, that's what He did. He did not leave us in a state where every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart is only evil all the time. That is not the final word of the Bible. Let us pray.